Okay, good evening, everybody. I am Alan Levine, and together with my colleague in American University, Tom Merrill, I run the Political Theory Institute, the host of this evening's conversation. I just want to quickly mention we have two other public events coming up this semester. On March 20th, we have Matthew Continetti of AEI and AU talking about what is conservatism today. And on April 20th, we have David Bromwich speaking about disorder and doctrine in America, some hints from Burke and Lincoln. But today, we are very fortunate to have Teresa Bejan of Oxford University talking about civility and the limits of toleration. Teresa Bejan is a professor of political theory and a fellow of Oriel College at the University of Oxford. In 2021, she was awarded the Philip Leverhulme Prize in Politics, which celebrates early career researchers who have already achieved international recognition and have exceptional future promise. So congratulations on that. Her first book, Mere Civility, Disagreement and the Limits of Toleration, on which our conversation today will be based, was called Penetrating and Sophisticated by the New York Times. She's currently completing her second book, First Among Equals, on the Forgotten History of Equality Before Modern Egalitarianism. And Professor Bejan also writes regularly for popular venues, including the New York Times, the Atlantic, and the Washington Post. And her 2018 TED Talk, Is Civility a Sham?, has received over 1.7 million views. That's a lot of people. She's got her bachelor's degree from the University of Chicago, her master's degree from the University of Cambridge, and her PhD from Yale. So Teresa, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
And I would like to start the conversation with something that you said at the beginning of your TED Talk. And yeah, you know what's coming. In your talk on civility, you began by rather incivilly saying that you thought civility was bullshit, or at one point in time, you thought that it was bullshit, and your view has changed somewhat. So can you walk us through that? What made you think that it was bullshit, and in what way have you changed your mind?
Right. Well, I guess the first thing to say is one of my key achievements in life, Alan, that you did not cite, was that I think I'm one of the only TED Talks to come with a content warning.
Yeah, well,
precisely because
I haven't seen enough of them to know, but yes, we're gonna have to put that on this event now too, I guess.
Yeah, no. So I came to the topic of civility for a number of reasons, but one of them was that I was just really interested in the way that civility talk, so talking about civility, or more precisely complaining about a loss of civility, or even more precisely complaining about just how uncivil our political opponents have become, was often a way of kind of avoiding a disagreement, or even sort of excluding certain people from the conversation, or silencing voices that we didn't want to hear. And so I was attuned to, let's say, like the exclusionary dynamics of the way that talking about civility often serves to suppress or exclude people that we deem to be kind of beyond the pale. And so, I guess some of my colleagues, my critical theory colleagues, would call this, civility as an exercise of or discourse of power, attuned to that aspect. But I also thought, well, yes, surely it does matter the manner in which people disagree. So I wasn't totally a kind of civility critic, but I certainly was a civility skeptic, let's say. I sort of suspected that many of the people who claimed to care about civility were more often concerned with silencing or suppressing people or arguments that they didn't want to hear.
Okay. All right. In your book, you refer to our own crisis of civility. And I think most Americans have some feeling about that we have something like that going on. So can you tell us what is civility and what is our crisis of civility?
Hmm. Well, maybe I'll begin just by seizing on the word "our" in that quotation,
Okay.
because I think it's probably worth just saying a bit about where I'm coming from. So, I've been a professor at Oxford for almost a decade now, but you can probably tell from my accent that I'm American, and my first job was in Canada. So I've been circling the Anglosphere for, for a number of years now. And so when I talk about our crisis of civility, um, I want to be a little bit careful because I do think that the crisis manifests differently in different places. But as an American, I think we recognize the crisis of civility as having to do with the sense that our democracy is more divided than ever before, the sense that there's a kind of surfeit of hateful rhetoric, especially online, and that we've sort of lost the ability to disagree without resorting to ad hominem argument or different kinds of strategies that again are meant about silencing, suppressing, or excluding, as opposed to actually having the disagreement that we should be having. So I understand civility then as the conversational virtue that's meant to help us have those disagreements, that is meant to make the sorts of disagreements that characterize a democratic society, but also maybe more importantly, a tolerant society, tolerable, right? So it's the virtue that allows us to tolerate disagreement. And that's really where I start in the book, of trying to then unpick kind of what it is we mean by civility, what exactly it is we think that we've lost, and then how, if we were to recover it, what would it look like?
Yeah, and you've called civility a virtue, and I think you just answered this that I was wondering about. Right, for Aristotle, something that's a virtue is the kind of perfection or the proper firing, if you will, of some natural faculty in us, right? And so you consider civility the virtue of conversation, right? That all humans talk, and it's the virtue. So it's talking properly or talking well.
Well, so I would narrow it even further. I'd say
Okay.
that civility is a conversational virtue, yes, but there are many conversational virtues. What's distinctive about civility is that it pertains to disagreement in particular. So it's about disagreeing well,
About
not just talking
disagreeing
well.
well.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay. And you link civility to toleration. And the problem for toleration, I think you nicely discuss throughout the book, has to do with reconciling both diversity and disagreement, right? Can you think us through the conflicts there?
Absolutely. It's a book about civility, but it's also a book about tolerance, or as I prefer to say, toleration, because, at heart, I'm an early modernist. And so whenever I can use a good early modern word, I will. Um, and the key, I mean, so the first move in the argument is to point out that tolerant societies are not simply societies wherein we permit diversity or differences of opinion. There are also societies where we propose to permit the expression of those differences. So that might seem sort of too obvious to say, but one of the things I want to
It's
point out
not,
in the book is
no.
that it's not obvious. It's not obvious. I mean, it's certainly someone like Thomas Hobbes thought it would be perfectly fine and absolutely inevitable that people would differ, that they would have these different opinions, but the freedom of conscience, on his view, sort of extended only to the limits of our cranial cavities, right? So the limits of the skull were the limits of expression on those differences. So in a tolerant society, we think that people should differ, but also that they should be able to express those differences, and that means inevitably that they will disagree. So a tolerant society must accommodate, on my view, both difference, but also the disagreements inspired by that difference.
Yeah, and so to say, if I can, the way each kind of threatens each other, right?
Mm-hmm.
That in order to protect diversity, we often want to clamp down on disagreements, right? Because disagreements threatens different groups. And
Mm-hmm.
and as we increase disagreement, as we say, that's a good thing for a society to have, for people to allow them to disagree with each other, that threatens diversity, right?
Yeah. So going back to the suspicion that civility is bullshit, I think that, I analyze that suspicion in the book as a matter of the way that different civility operate in the way that you identify. They try to solve the problem either by suppressing diversity for the sake of having better disagreements, because obviously, disagreements become easier as they become more superficial, let's say, is
right.
a way of characterizing it.
Sure.
Or they attempt to suppress disagreement for the sake of the not only peaceful accommodation, but even, let's say, the sort of acceptance or even celebration of diversity. And so the trick for me was to say, well, what would civility look like if it aimed at accommodating and preserving both diversity and disagreement? But the kind of central, maybe psychological insight of the book, and the one that attracts me ultimately to the 17th century, which is very much kind of where my historical expertise is focused, is on something that Hobbes, I think, diagnoses really well. It's what we might call the disagreeableness of disagreement. There's something about disagreement itself that is a bit insulting. So, sometimes you'll hear Obama, for instance, used to talk about this. Now there are various podcasts dedicated to trying to disagree agreeably, right? As this is the model. What civility helps us do is disagree agreeably. I think that's completely wrong. Disagreement is disagreeable. There's a reason that disagreeable is a synonym for unpleasant. And any theory, let alone practice of civility, has got to accept and reckon with that first. We've got to acknowledge that, or else any sort of proposals for civility we have are probably just covert attempts to sacrifice diversity for the sake of disagreement, or disagreement for the sake of diversity. And again, we say, no, civility means we want to preserve both.
Yeah, and I'm gonna, in a minute or two, I want to go through your work on the 17th century and the three main authors that you talk about. But first, the compelling part of the book for me especially is your sobriety, right? Your lack of illusions, your wanting to keep it real, so to speak, and not get carried away with all of the highfalutin desires of philosophy. And so you write in the conclusion, right, that we should have no illusions about the nature of a tolerant society, that it's a tolerant society is not guaranteed to be pleasant, harmonious, or particularly peaceful. And that's just the nature of the beast. There's no getting around that, right? Could you elaborate on that a little?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the historical transformations I became interested in sort of early on in writing the book was just the transformation of the meaning of the word tolerance, or the adjective tolerant. So in the 20th and 21st centuries, tolerance has come to mean a very sort of positive affect with respect to difference. To tolerate difference is not only to accept, but maybe even celebrate it. It's to embrace diversity. We think about thinking about diversity and inclusion as good things that we should embrace or celebrate. And that's really at odds with the kind of the medieval or early modern sense of tolerance, which was precisely a kind of negative affective orientation, to say that the thing that we are tolerating is an evil, and we tolerate it because it's evil. It's the idea that eliminating the evil would be worse than permitting it to be. And so we exercise a kind of sufferance or forbearance with respect to that thing. And so partly what I wanted to do was recover that sense of tolerance. And again, here, I mean, the civility argument is one of the things that we are called upon to tolerate in a tolerant society is the disagreeableness of disagreement, that unpleasantness, that discomfort that comes from routinely contesting the things that matter most.
And your bête noire in the book is really those people who want to celebrate difference and think that we can do that without conflict, right? And you think that's a step too far to demand of people?
So, I mean, let's say I have plenty of bête noire in the book.
You know, that's true.
Why limit myself to one? But certainly, I was and remain frustrated, I think, with I mean, it's the tendency to moralism in a lot of political theory or a lot of commentary on the crisis of civility, the sort of temptation to peddle pieties, sort of the rehearsal of statements like we must celebrate diversity in a way that becomes totally detached from the kind of practical reality of living with or coexisting with people that we regard to be, fundamentally in error or indeed, culpably in error. And so there comes a point where the sort of the political theory or the sort of the abstract ways in which we describe the ideal of the society we want to inhabit becomes so far divorced from the actual practical challenges that we're confronting that I think they become not just kind of unhelpful, but positively counterproductive. They end up holding up an ideal of what life in a tolerant society should look like, that is ironically sort of fundamentally opposed to that society remaining tolerant. And so that move, right, where the theory of a tolerant society actually becomes a justification for intolerance, is one that we can see historically very clearly, and one I think that continues to bedevil, discussions among political theorists about tolerance and its demands.
Yeah, and I don't know if I want to name names if I can, because running throughout the book is that there are a few names that come up as sort of the opposite approach to you or a different approach to you, right? And I'd say the three that jumped out at me would be John Rawls, Jeremy Waldron, and Martha Nussbaum. And that all of them, well-known political theorists at the top of the profession, but the consistent critique, it seems to me, that you make of them is that they are too demanding, right? That they expect too much from people, and in pursuing the too much, as you just said, it opens the doors to intolerance. Is that right?
Yeah, and it's I blush because as much as I talk about mere civility as a kind of naming names and calling out, I also want to remain decorous, but I think the way you described it there is exactly.
I'm sorry you convinced me. I'm doing what you preach.
I know. Yeah, so I mean, but partly I think we should keep it real also, and remember that this book is my first book, and it was based on my PhD thesis. And so part of what I was doing in the thesis and then in the book was exactly punching up, as you say, trying to show how key figures in this debate have, I think, gone wrong. And what all these three have in common is that they're all liberals. And it's become clearer to me since the book has been published, but I think was certainly in the background when I was writing it, was a kind of frustration with the way in which sort of 20th century and 21st century liberalism had lost touch with the kind of unmessy realities that had given rise to what we might think of then as becoming important liberal principles, like freedom of religion, freedom of speech, etc. And so
you mean they lost touch with the messy principles, right? Not you said unmessy.
Oh yeah, no, exactly. With the messy, right? So the messy and even, let's say, murderous conditions that led to these kinds of political insights. And I was and remain very worried about the health of a liberalism that is unwilling to confront that messiness, or sort of, really speak forthrightly about what's demanded of us in a society that tries to organize itself along, principles of tolerance and also individual freedoms in these ways.
Yeah. And so you uh another aspect of your conclusion is seems to be to have low expectations. And I don't mean uh that uh um civility is impossible, but civility uh, defined up into respect and celebration,
Mhm.
right? That becomes problematic. And so we need a much narrower vision of civility, what you call mere civility,
Mhm.
right? So low expectations and then thick skins, right? We all
Mhm.
need to develop thick skins as other people celebrating or performing or being themselves say things and do things that we don't like. But if it's limited to the realm of words, I guess, then we ought to be thick-skinned enough to deal with it.
Yeah, so the mereness of mere civility becomes really important on my argument. So, and the word mere itself is really interesting. So today we understand it mainly as expressing a kind of minimal character, sort of low expectations, as you say, kind of grudgingness. But in early modern English, mere also means pure. So the idea of mere civility is, as you say, about a kind of low but solid understanding of what's required from us in order to coexist peacefully in the midst of diversity and disagreement, but also a sense of trying to understand the distinctiveness of civility as a virtue and not conflate it with other good things. So certainly a big sort of argument of the book is that we should have lower expectations with respect to what's possible, what to expect from our disagreements in a tolerant society. But it's also just to try to resist a tendency in political theory, and also I think in kind of broader public debates, to insist that all good things must go together all of the time. And really just sort of say, well, civility is the kind of virtue we fall back on precisely when we can't respect one another, or precisely when we won't be able to celebrate one another or embrace one another. And it's not to say that those ideals are never appropriate or not, are never worth pursuing. I think they are, although I think probably pursuing them on the level of society as such is always going to end in tears. Um, but that when we try to turn civility into those things, we lose the distinctiveness of civility and the precise work it can and must do in a tolerant society.
Yeah, and would you agree with this, that a lot of today's theorists, the dominant ones, they want a pure theory? You talked about mere as pure, a pure theory, but meaning almost like the best that they can imagine, right? Purely good, purely just,
Mm.
and which is, in a certain way lovely, right? But not so practical, and that entails all sorts of risks in going for sort of, the fullness of the vision.
Yeah, I mean, we might, to put it in the terms of academic political theory, we might say this is a disagreement about method and sort of, how, I mean, you describe my approach as one of keeping it real. We might say, well, this is kind of a realist critique of a certain kind of ideal theorizing, which is about the kind of specification of the overarching ideal to which we ought to aspire in the reform of our political institutions. And a question I ask explicitly in the book, and I talk a bit about, is just how aspirational should our political theories be if they're going to remain political theories, right? So
Yeah.
how do we keep in touch with the realities of coexistence in a tolerant society? Um, and how do we resist the pull of moralizing and, turning our political theories into moral theories? And again, like I'm a, I like to think that I myself am tolerant. I'm not I don't want to be overly prescriptive about what political theory is or should look like. But what I'm arguing for is a kind of pluralism with respect to political theory approaches. And certainly I think trying to restore a sense of reality to a particular debate, the debate about tolerance,
Yeah.
civility, and free speech, where I think it's kind of, really worryingly lacking.
Okay. Yeah, good. And so the way you approach the question of toleration is to go back to 17th century England, and there's three main figures you look at. But before we go into those three figures, you reflect at some length about the similarities between the disagreements and problems of 17th century political life and today. Can you talk about that? Because someone might be sitting out there and say, 17th century England, what does that have to do with us today? It's got to be completely different worlds.
It's so funny. When I was writing the dissertation and then first publishing the book, I think that historical move was a harder sell then than it is now. I think that there's a kind of growing cultural awareness, now in 2023, about the similarities between the effects of the printing press as a revolution in communications technology and the effects of the internet or social media on social cohesion and the dynamics of disagreement. So when I was working on the thesis and trying to publish the book, I had to do quite a lot of work to make that comparison and argue for its plausibility. And I think maybe, but anyway, I'll continue to justify it. I mean, the move is to say the crisis of civility in 20th and 21st century America and other liberal democracies is just the latest manifestation of an old problem. And although my focus is 16th and 17th century European debates about religious toleration, I also link it back to Greek political thought and the ideal of homonoia or like-mindedness in Plato and Aristotle, and the worry that disagreements led to a kind of discord that ultimately undermined political friendship as the bond that held a political community together. I think you see the same kind of concerns in debates after the Protestant Reformation, where it's not just the worry that religious dissent or division has led to a kind of a figurative and even literal dismemberment of the body of Christ as the sort of the true church, but also that our disagreements about those differences has led to a kind of pollution of the public sphere, one that is facilitated by this new technology of the printing press that is deployed with absolute trolling aplomb by people like Martin Luther to not only disseminate their views, but also anathematize their opponents. And so, I reframe the Protestant Reformation as giving rise to the first modern crisis of civility as a kind of epidemic of hate speech or religious insult. And once you sort of recognize that problem, you don't have to go far to look for great examples of the sorts of insults that these people were hurling at each other. And so I have a bit of fun with that.
Yeah, it's very, very colorful, those insults. But so today, we're worried that our society is heading towards civil war, that the partisans on different sides are so far apart that can't talk to each other, can't cooperate with each other. But in early modern Europe, there was actually a civil war, right, between Catholics and Protestants over the true teaching of Jesus, and where Catholics were murdering Protestants and Protestants were murdering Catholics, and different Protestant sects were fratricidally murdering other Protestants, right? And so this is the context in which you are writing, right? Where the cultural norm has completely broken down, and there are radically different views about what to do, all claiming to somehow be the true, authentic way to go. All right. And so in the most general language, they all agree, but in the specifics, they're very much at war with each other. Right. And so that does seem like a place from which we might learn something.
Well, yeah, certainly I think so, and I'm happy to meet others so persuaded. It's not, I don't discuss this example directly in the book, but I've written about it a bit subsequently, about the analysis of stasis or civil war in Coursera in Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. It's a famous discussion. I'm sure many in the audience are familiar with it, but for those who aren't, Thucydides describes the descent of modern day Corfu into civil war in the context of this greater Peloponnesian War. And one of the most memorable aspects of this that he describes is that how people, co-citizens were speaking the same language, using the same words, but understanding the meaning of these words in totally opposite ways. And so the loss of shared meanings as being somehow emblematic of the society at civil war. And so certainly that breakdown, not only of civility, but also just of the possibility of a kind of disagreement when not only our principles, but even just the language that we use or the way that we understand the principles we're meant to share just becomes so polarized that the disagreement not only gets nowhere, but seems to accelerate this kind of social fracture. So pointing out the resonance of that to our contemporary sort of worries about partisanship and polarization, but also to argue that the crisis of civility isn't the cause of the social fracture and breakdown. It's a symptom. And it's a symptom that can absolutely exacerbate and accelerate that breakdown. But again, going back to sort of low expectations, I also kind of wanted to chasten expectations about what a restoration of civility can accomplish. I don't think that simply talking right or disagreeing better is going to solve the problem of partisanship or the problem of polarization in American democracy. It's not, and I don't think we should kid ourselves that it will. But that isn't to say that civility isn't important or that it can't help mitigate some of these problems that we're confronting.
Or to use another formulation that you use in the book, that then basically the underlying problem of disagreement is a fundamental human problem that's always going to exist. And it's one that can't be, quote unquote, solved. It just needs to be managed.
Absolutely right. To say, yeah, precisely that. That, if we set out trying to solve problems that are in fact constitutive of the sorts of societies we claim to want to live in, then I think we're not only setting ourselves up for disappointment, we're actually, working on a recipe for turning our tolerant society into something else entirely. So, I say in the book that a tolerant society can't pick it and choose its materials and remain tolerant for long. But I think that's really just worth pointing out, that very often tolerant societies try to maintain their tolerant character by systematically excluding those they deem to be intolerant. And, Karl Popper describes this as the paradox of tolerance. And I think there's kind of revival of Popperian instincts among young progressives, especially today. But I think it's an old temptation.
With like banning hate speech and that kind of thing. Yeah.
Absolutely. The idea that we must not tolerate intolerance. And that tolerance, in fact, demands that we not tolerate the intolerant. But that's not just young progressives. That's not just Karl Popper. That's also John Locke. That's also John Rawls. That's also Rousseau. Okay. So it's an old argument. It has it's an appealing, or even in some ways intuitive argument. But part of my historical work in the book is to say that not only is it a kind of problematic argument, it's also one that that there are alternatives. There are other ways of thinking and approaching tolerance.
Okay, let me just tell the audience, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A function, and we'll come to those in a little bit. So I'd like to turn now to the three authors that your analysis of the three authors that form the core of the book, and they're Roger Williams, Thomas Hobbes, and John Locke. And Hobbes and Locke are obviously giants of the political theory canon, regularly taught in universities. Roger Williams, not so much. But yet, of the three, Roger Williams is the one whose views you prefer. So let's start with him, and you kind of go first with the one you prefer in the book. So tell us a little bit first, give us some background. Who is Roger Williams? What did he do? And then what about his views attract you so much?
It's worth maybe saying two things first, which is that the three author organization is also a legacy of the fact that this was a dissertation. But I also think it helps me make the argument that I want to make. And certainly in elevating Williams over these better known figures, that's, that it's important for me, but it's also a reflection of my training at Cambridge with Quentin Skinner, and the fact that I'm a kind of Cambridge School contextualist who thinks that we ought to expand our reading of the history of political thought beyond the canon. But why Williams in particular? Well, Williams is maybe known to some people in the audience, or most people in the audience, as the founder of Rhode Island. But he's one of these many Puritans who flees England in the 1630s in order to, find a better life in New England among the Society of Saints, i.e. Boston. I don't think that worked out that well for him. He pretty soon ends up offending everybody by arguing, for instance, that the English Christians had immorally expropriated the American Indians, but he had other offensive opinions. But anyway, he ends up being banished from Massachusetts. He finds shelter with some of the local Native American peoples and ends up founding the colony of Rhode Island, which at the time and for a long time after, I would argue, is the most tolerant society the world had ever seen. There is no established church in Rhode Island, but it's also committed to a system of tolerance that modern liberals would recognize, i.e. it sees liberty of conscience as demanding not only freedom of worship or exercise, but also freedom of speech and freedom of association. So again, this is familiar to Americans as the model of religious toleration we find in the First Amendment. But it's really not at all an intuitive one, or indeed a very popular, widespread one in the 17th century. But Williams, I argue, comes to it because he's a particularly intolerant and uncompromising evangelical Christian. And it's that counterintuitive conclusion, right, where his own theological intolerance is what allows him to imagine a society in which saints coexist peacefully alongside sinners, as well as pagans and idolaters, that I find really interesting about Williams. And it's a view that I think is pretty much entirely absent from the canon of political philosophy as we know and love it.
Yeah, and so Williams' own Incivility, he broke laws in Massachusetts, and he was very rude to people, and regularly got himself in trouble that way. But when he left the Massachusetts Bay Colony and founded the Rhode Island and Providence Plantations Colony, I think that's the actual name, right? He introduced a scheme of toleration, right, based on a distinction between civil law and spiritual law. Is that the right way to put it? And could you tell us about that?
Well, I think the distinction is even more expansive. So it's between civility as the essence of civil life, so life in earthly societies,
right,
which necessarily bring
yeah,
the redeemed and the damned together. So you might think it's sort of an Augustinian way of understanding the city of God and the city of man. And spirituality then is being the standard of true goodness that will redeem human beings as fallen creatures and allow them to enter heaven. And I would argue that Williams discovers this distinction and ends up, becoming kind of obsessed with it because of his experiences among the Native Americans. And it's precisely his interest in and kind of, just evangelical zeal for American language, culture, and his American advocacy that leads him to just be struck by the fact that when he's expelled in the dead of winter by his fellow Christians, or as he calls them, the unchristian Christians of New England, it's these pagans who take him in and tolerate his presence. And so for Williams, this is proof positive that a civil society need not be a Christian society, and that the standards of civility and the standards of spirituality not only can be, but really ought to be separated. And he uses this very important phrase that's later quoted by Thomas Jefferson, that there ought to be a wall of separation between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world.
And so is the realm of civility that should be regulated by the political authorities, that things having to do with the body and property, and things that have to do with the soul and salvation. He wants a complete free-for-all.
I mean, it's one way of putting it, but it's the freedom of seeking the truth. So here he's a real Puritan and Protestant. I mean, he is just so worried about sinfulness and the existential risks of engaging in spiritual worship with those one isn't entirely sure are redeemed. That leads him, he joins a dozen different churches during his lifetime, including the Baptist church, but there's no church that he joins in his lifetime that he doesn't also leave, because he's worried that they're unregenerate. So I joke in the book that at the end of his life, he's worshiping in a congregation of 2, him and his wife, and he's not sure about her, right? But it's that kind of, again, that intolerance of error that it makes him really value the freedom to not only associate, but to disassociate. And so how do you construct a society that accommodates that freedom of searching for religious truth without then dissolving into civil war?
Right. And so to go back to the terms of diversity and disagreement, right? So he sees diversity in the world, right? That this is a fundamental fact. And he demands some kind of respectful behavior towards others, right? You can't like bop them on the head and take their stuff, right? But he's very interested in what, it's basically evangelical speech, right? Trying to recruit the other to your point of view, right? Mm-hmm. And which is often seen as disrespectful, right? But it leads him in a certain way to interact, not just simply tolerate, but also interact with the others with whom he disagrees, right? And so he insists on a kind of duty to associate with others, to talk to them, to listen to them, even if you think that they are loathsome degenerates, right? And so the conversation is not simple. It's not really a civil conversation. It's an antagonistic one, right? Full of, telling the other person, you're going to hell, right? I mean, literally, you're going to hell. And you need to change fundamentally and get on board, my ship, right? So there's a kind of, veneer of civility indeed, but a much more forceful incivility of conversation, but out of good motives. Is that?
Yeah, so I mean, Williams makes a number of distinctions that I think are helpful, but one is between what he calls the sword of steel, or the civil sword. So that's the idea of the punishments that are wielded by the state. So being able to imprison or indeed even execute people. That's a sort of steel, so physical violence, and then the sword of the spirit, which he associates with the tongue. So the sword of speech. And he thinks that the sword of speech is the appropriate method of spiritual warfare. So Williams is a virtuoso of what we today would call hate speech, but what early modern observers called persecution of the tongue. He refers to Catholics as anti-Christian, so followers of the papal Antichrist. He calls his American Indian friends devil worshippers to their face. You know, he thinks the point of engagement is to call out sin. You know, that's the original sense of Protestantism, as a kind of protest against iniquity. But nevertheless, he sees society then as providing a kind of earthly peace that allows this spiritual warfare to continue. And he thinks that the worst thing that ever happened to Christianity was the conversion of Constantine, that allowed Christians to conflate the sword of the spirit, the tongue, and the sword of steel, the coercive apparatus of the state. And so the work of religious toleration for Williams is disaggregating, distinguishing these things again. But because of that, there's just no way that he thinks a tolerant society is going to be one wherein people accept or embrace or even celebrate their differences. That's not the point. The point of a tolerant society is to provide the conditions wherein this spiritual warfare can proceed without descending into civil war.
Right. And so for us today, it would mean everyone saying actually what they believe, right, is for the good of the country, something like that, right? Even if it's going to hurt other people's feelings and other people are going to feel that as an insult, right? But limiting it to words, but with a spirited conversation.
Yeah. So I think you know, there's a kind of ambivalence of what we mean by respect, and maybe describing this. So one way of thinking about what Williams is demanding is that we respect one another enough to say what we really think about each other and everyone's wrong views to their face, not behind their back. And that does express a kind of respect. But on the other hand, it can feel profoundly disrespectful, insulting. You know, it's worse than the disagreeableness of disagreement. It leads to a profound sense of hurt and wounding, and as well as anger and everything else. But Williams thinks that commitment to engagement is essential to the preservation of civil society. And so in the book, I really resist describing that as respect, because I think respect in modern parlance, and particularly in political theory, is a kind of moral commitment to recognizing personhood and everything else. And I think that it's a language, it's not Williams' language, and I think it confuses rather than clarifies. But there is a sense in which, if we do each other the honor of actually engaging with each other, then that makes possible a kind of political, not only coexistence, but collaboration that is not possible if we don't do this. Because if we think our co-citizens are wrong, but we either don't respect them enough or are too afraid to tell them that we do, or tell them why, then that leads to precisely this kind of dissociation and the fracturing of society that we might then think leads to something like civil war. So Williams's analysis is totally at odds with the analysis offered by Thomas Hobbes, for instance.
Yeah, so that I want to move on to Hobbes now. Good.
Yeah.
We'll talk about Hobbes and Locke a little bit more quickly.
Okay.
But go on to Hobbes. So Hobbes is your second main figure, and he's got a different path to civility. What's his?
So let's handle Hobbes and Locke together. I mean, so from the Williams view that I've just described for you, I distill a theory of mere civility as demanding really two things fundamentally. One, that we continue to engage and have these disagreeable disagreements. So that's one. Civility means that we engage in disagreement with others. But two, it also means that we cultivate, as you said, thicker skins, in the sense that, you know, one of the key demands of civility in a tolerant society will be tolerating incivility, right? It's inevitable that our disagreeable disagreements are going to lead to this kind of negative affect. So what civility demands is that we prepare to tolerate that and continue the disagreement anyway. For Hobbes, civility is rather about trying to eliminate the disagreeable disagreement by eliminating disagreement. So Hobbes offers a theory of civility that I call civil silence. Perfectly fine for us to differ within the private spheres of our skulls, but once we express those differences, the dynamics of disagreement are necessarily going to lead to social fracture and division. Locke, on the other hand, I argue, you know, one of the interesting things about Locke is that he's famous to us as, you know, maybe the father of liberal tolerance or toleration, but he starts out endorsing the Hobbist position in his earliest writings on religious difference. But ultimately, Locke changes his mind and concludes that actually, no, tolerance is possible, but he's still very worried about the limits of tolerance. And so Locke is very clear that a tolerant society cannot tolerate the intolerant, it cannot tolerate atheists, it cannot tolerate Catholics who are intolerant on his view, as well as Turks, by which he means Ottoman Muslims. And so it's a form of tolerance that becomes obsessed with policing the limits of diversity. And I argue that he does this for the sake of an understanding of civility that looks a lot more like Christian charity. It's not just that we're sort of putting up with the existence of the other in a tolerant society, it's that we're actually needing to embrace them as a friend and brother. And again, I think that that's a mistake.
Okay, so a few more words on each of them in turn. So for Hobbes, the problem for him, right, is that people are much thinner skinned, that people are very sensitive to insults, right, and against their honor, and so they perceive what we might call microaggressions everywhere, right? In a sneer, in a gesture, in a look, in laughter, and this drives them crazy, right? And they feel that they've been dissed, and Hobbes fears that that's going to lead from a battle of words to a battle of swords and actual violence, right? And so what he wants to do is to clamp down to prevent the disagreements from being made public. And on the one hand, you know, this is like a lot better than the Spanish Inquisition, right, where you had to think the right thing in your head, right, because he doesn't want the state to go in and manage your beliefs, but he just wants the state to regulate your behavior, including your words, in public. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think one of the things I point out in the book is just the continued appeal of the Hobbesian argument. When we say things like, oh, well, we should just agree to disagree, or don't discuss politics and religion at the dinner table, these kinds of strategies of strategic silence, I think, you know, are clearly they clearly work in certain contexts. And so what Hobbes wants to do, I think, is sort of, you know, build that up on the level of society itself. And yeah, I think so. My reading of Hobbes, let's say for other political theorists in the audience, my reading of Hobbes is perhaps different than others, but it's trying to show that in a way Hobbes is extremely tolerant. He's more tolerant than Roger Williams, certainly, of the fact that people will err, but he thinks that the presence of a disagreement and the expression of that disagreement are two totally different things.
Yeah, and so the policy implications of that is that the state should clamp down on disagreements for the sake of avoiding conflict, for the sake of avoiding people's hurt feelings, which will lead to conflict. And so among the other the things that you kind of list for him in terms of that is, kind of a duty for discretion of individuals to be careful about what you say, which can lead to inauthentic professions, or statements on your part, so you don't offend somebody, but also a kind of press censorship and state regulation of what can be taught and preached.
And Hobbes is explicit about all of these things, but I think that one of the things that political theorists are maybe less good at than other historians is trying to situate Hobbes's arguments in the context of the actual policies that exist or are being debated at the time. So part of what I'm doing is linking Hobbes's arguments to the actually existing hate speech laws in the 16th and 17th century. So all of the ways in which different countries and different regimes were proposing actually to try to regulate religious disagreements.
Yeah, and when it comes to Locke, who you call the villain of the book at one point, I wasn't so happy. I wasn't so happy with that. I'll confess. But you call him the villain of the book. But my sense is what you really dislike is the way in which his views, the way you describe them, come to be replicated later. And let's say, especially today with maybe Rawls and Waldron and Nussbaum, but that Locke wants a kind of mutual recognition based on charity, people agreeing on what we can all agree with and what's reasonable, and which is a lovely thing, and it leads to a kind of a thick community, right? But in order to achieve that thickness, all the people who are deemed unreasonable somehow have to be excluded. And so it ends up being in a very kind of elitist, to use your word, vision of toleration.
That's right. I mean, again, to say that Locke is the villain, that's to be provocative. And I should say, my next project after the equality book is that I'm actually editing the Clarendon edition of Locke's Letters on Toleration. So, I remain a kind of Lockean. He's in safe hands. It's not a hit job or anything. But I did and do want to insist that the kind of reputation that Locke has as the key proponent or defender of religious toleration in England in the 17th century is not really a good reflection of his actual position vis-a-vis these other people who are arguing for toleration. So Locke, for instance, is much less tolerant than Roger Williams was, along a bunch of different dimensions. But yes, you're absolutely right that I think the same instincts that lead Locke to be less tolerant than Williams are replicated then in modern liberal arguments about tolerance, in ways that we can diagnose, I think, and recognize better if we're aware of the history that informed Locke's own theorizing.
Okay, let's go to some questions now. So here we have a question. People are, very much in our own moment. It's from Olivia Traub. Do you believe that the ability to have constructive disagreements has deteriorated with the presence of the internet?
So certainly, I mean, you and I have been talking about this, Alan. I think that the rise of the internet and the rise of social media have led to precisely the kind of crisis of civility that early modern Christians were confronting after the rise of the printing press. So yes, I think social media in particular exacerbate the disagreeableness of disagreement. And one of the ways in which they do this is by encouraging us and also facilitating our sorting into like-minded enclaves. So going back to the idea of Williams, that the key thing was actually to have the disagreement and continually interact with the person with whom we disagree fundamentally. The problem with social media, and I think it's much worse than with the printing press, although analogous, is that the ways in which we can sort ourselves into communities of the like-minded, or indeed with algorithmic editorial work, we actually are sorted into like-minded enclaves without even recognizing this is happening. And the problem is that when we spend all of our time in the more agreeable company of the like-minded, then disagreement begins to feel even more threatening whenever we encounter it. And we're more tempted than ever to assume that the people with whom we disagree with us not only because they're bad at reasoning, or or simply have reasoned in error, but also that they are malicious, insane, bigoted, interested, whatever. We begin to sort of hypothesize about the reasons for the disagreement in ways that make it really difficult to engage or make our society more just together.
Okay, thank you. I have a couple of more questions from undergrads. Nick Paris asks, does Williams believe that people possess the sword of spirit by nature or nurture? Does he believe that all can possess it?
So can you just say the beginning of that question again?
Does Williams, Roger Williams, believe that people possess the sword of spirit by nature or nurture? Does he believe that all can possess it?
Well, so as whether or not every human being possesses the faculty of speech, I think he sides with Aristotle and says, yes, this is kind of definitive of what it means to be a human being with a soul. But Williams adds to that the idea that every human being has a soul that must be saved and then must do his part in saving the souls of others. And so he doesn't think that everybody has access to true religion by nature. So he doesn't endorse the idea of natural religion. Indeed, one of the things that makes him so excited and intent on learning the languages of the Native Americans is because he thinks that they haven't been exposed to revelation. And it's his job then to preach the gospel and good news to them, because without his doing that, then they are condemned to be damned. But he is, because of this, also very sensitive to the ways in which whatever people happen to believe, we always think we have good reasons for believing the things that we do or thinking that we're right or righteous, but that usually what we believe is a product of our upbringing and circumstances and not a product of reasoned reflection or anything else. And so Williams is attuned to what John Rawls called the burdens of judgment. But he also has a sense of the responsibility of Christians to not only evangelize but also argue and disagree and do their part. So the sort of the spirit is accessible to all, but everyone can also do a better job of wielding it responsibly.
Okay, thank you. So from an undergraduate, Francine Warsoff, in wake of the modern day issue, the inability to disagree amid the partisanship and polarization, you emphasize diversity and disagreement, that a tolerant society is not guaranteed to be peaceful. Do you think the lack of tolerance is being able to the lack of tolerance and being able to disagree is rooted in extremism?
No, because I think it's rooted in a sort of basic feature of human psychology that all of us share, not necessarily to a strictly equal extent. I think that some people are more sensitive to disagreement than others. And I think, that could be naturally, but it also could be because of culture, education. I mean, certainly, as a woman, I'm often conscious of having been socialized in ways that make disagreement feel more threatening than for my husband, for instance. I think that there are very different social norms actually for different people differentially placed in a society. Nevertheless, as human beings, I think we all have this kind of predisposition to righteousness. So Locke famously describes it in terms of every church or every person being orthodox to itself. But Williams too has a sense of every person thinks that they're right, they might think that with sort of greater or lesser intensity. They might be more or less open to being persuaded that they're not. But that sense of intuitive righteousness, and then the disagreeableness that comes when they encounter people who don't share their right views, that's a feature as well as a bug of the human condition.
Okay. Thank you. I have a question from my colleague, David Fagelson. He has two questions. And the second one, I think, is some kind of Cambridge ritual or something,
I know.
or Oxford ritual. But here's the philosophical question first. So liberalism requires us to tolerate opinions with which we disagree, and even those that offend us. Recently, however, in a sort of medicalization of offense, people have claimed that having to put up with certain viewpoints may cause such mental anguish or trauma that it constitutes a harm that justifies censorship. The incident at Brown University over a debate about rape culture comes to mind. Can liberalism reconcile itself with this view? If so, how? If not, what answer can it make to this charge of causing literal trauma? Telling people to just suck it up doesn't seem very civil, but is that what the liberal argument amounts to?
I don't think it reduces to that, but I do think that going back to the sort of idea that we've got to be real about what life in a tolerant society demands, I think there is a sort of way of, just acknowledging that, living in a society that is inclusive and diverse presents challenges. And we, and those challenges require sort of a cultivation, not of insensitivity, but of less sensitivity, I think, to offensiveness or insult. But I think I want to go to the first part of that question, because I think it's really interesting, and it's something I've been thinking about a lot in my work on free speech. And I think that there were really good political and legal reasons for if feminists, for instance, in the 80s and 90s critical race theorists and legal scholarship to push the analogy of the harms of hate speech to physical violence and assault. There were good reasons for doing that, as trying to alert people to the harms of hateful speech. But I think that, a rhetorical move, a metaphor, an analogy that was, useful politically and legally, has now kind of risen to the level of a kind of fundamental confusion about the difference between verbal harms and physical harm, or we might say verbal violence and physical violence. Again, I think the analogy is useful, but the point of an analogy or the point of a metaphor is that there's actually fundamentally a difference between the two things that we're comparing. And yeah, to answer your question, I don't think that a liberal democracy can encourage that conflation, because ultimately our institutions demand that we distinguish between words and swords, between words and physical violence. Now, my own views, I'm a free speech fundamentalist, but I'm not a free speech absolutist. I think there are absolutely
what do you mean by that? Make that distinction between fundamentalist and absolutist.
Right. So a free speech fundamentalist says that the values that come under the umbrella of free speech are particularly precious or important for the kinds of society that I want to live in. So the idea that it's important for individuals to be able to speak frankly or freely, to express the inward contents of their minds outwardly, that's really an important aspect of a tolerant society or a civil society. Or the idea that in a democracy, we really want all of its members to be able to not only have a voice, but to get that voice heard. That voice is particularly important in a democratic society. So when I say I'm a free speech fundamentalist, it's because I think that those values are essential. to a tolerant society and a liberal society. But I'm not an absolutist in the sense that I don't then think that there are no forms of speech that can be rightly restricted or even outlawed. Right. So I think contracts should be binding. I think there's such a thing as incitement. I don't propose to tolerate fraud. So, I wouldn't say, I'm not saying that a liberal society has to tolerate all speech every time, absolutely whatsoever.
But
But mhm.
so someone who claims, mental anguish or trauma, what do you say to that person?
I say that is horrible. I'm so sorry. That is really awful. And I think partly a lot of times what's needed there is recognition and sympathy. But then, any mental health professional will tell you that the way to deal with trauma is to work it through, right? So, we think about talking therapies, we think about all these things. And so, it's the idea that you deal with trauma by working with the powers that be to eliminate any possibility of re-exposure or re-traumatizing, that actually leads to an increased sensitivity to the source of harm. So I think, I don't think I think that the debate about free speech, like every other debate, it has been sort of unhelpfully polarized between people who want to say, suck it up, buttercup, and people who want to say, um, please protect my feelings. It's possible to say, to recognize the pain and suffering that comes with emotional trauma and everything else, and say, nevertheless, that strategies other than suppression or censorship or regulation of harmful speech, of hurtful speech, are necessary.
Right. So not preventing it in advance, but helping a person who feels that deal with it. Is that what I'm?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think it can be reduced to a kind of pre-publication or post hoc kind of distinction. But yeah,
Okay.
I say to my students sometimes, when you encounter something that you object to, reactions other than outrage are possible. But you might say, like, reactions other than calling for this thing to be banned, or reactions other than demanding that the offensive speaker be silenced, are possible. There are other strategies, there are other ways in which to deal with the upset and hurt.
Okay. All right. So the other question that came along with that is, do your students still jump over a burning boat during bumps weeks? What are the college's insurance bills? I don't know what that means.
The answer is, but only when we win.
Oh, okay, I'm not going to ask for a clarification or an explanation. We have another question about harm. And this is from Borden Flanagan, my colleague here at American University, who says hello.
Hi, Borden.
And says, what do you make of the expansion of what is called harm? Doesn't that operate as a rhetorical move to constrain toleration and narrow the range of acceptable debate?
Yes, I mean, so that's maybe a much more elegant way of putting the point I was trying to make earlier, which is that the harm inflation, it has taken advantage of a kind of rhetorical move that was made, in the 80s and 90s, to effectively, yes, shut down not only certain forms of disagreement, but actually call for the restriction of permissible differences of opinion in a way that is fundamentally at odds with a tolerant society, on my view.
Okay, thank you. Here, Borden has another question. Is virtue a better framework for speech and toleration than rights? Is the value of toleration peace, i.e., as a floorboard of the social good, or is it constitutive of the ends of society? If the latter, what ends and how understood? Equality, virtue? Wouldn't this place boundaries on how much toleration we want?
Okay, so that's a complex question. So I'll take the first part first. Initially, in thinking about civility, I was very skeptical of virtue language. And a lot of that, I think, had to do, again, with the fact that it was a dissertation, and I really wanted to distinguish what I was doing from virtue ethics or kind of neo-Aristotelian approaches to these questions. Now that, now that I've published the book, I'm a professor. I'm not, trying to climb up the greasy pole so much anymore. I'm a little more relaxed. I embrace virtue language, but I would still want to distinguish the way I describe civility as a conversational virtue from more robust or perfectionist understandings of virtue and like virtue ethics. I find them, I can find those arguments appealing, but again, I think much like the liberal arguments, the post-Rawlsian liberal arguments I critique in the book, I think the virtue ethics arguments have a way of getting too divorced from the realities of what it is like to live in a tolerant society as a frail and finite creature, like a human being. But speaking of the ends of a tolerant society, I mean, I'm persuaded by the Williams line that we ought to be quite chastened in what we take the ends of a earthly society to be. In the book, I'm quite emphatic that a civil society, on my view, so a tolerant society can be a civil society if we understand civility in the way that I do, but it won't necessarily be a just society, nor will it be necessarily an equal society, which isn't to say that equality and justice aren't worth pursuing. Indeed, I think they are. And what civility does is it helps us pursue those goods in the context while maintaining the character of our tolerant society. But I think the spirit of your question is right, which is that I am ultimately skeptical that all of the goods we hope to pursue are as compatible as we think they are. So to just give you an example, the kind of ubiquitous slogan, diversity, equality, and inclusion, or I guess now it's not even equality, it's diversity, equity, and inclusion. We say these things as though they necessarily go together. I think it's not clear that they do, or certainly there's quite a lot of hard work that needs to be done to reconcile the three. So I'd say to both questions, there's a kind of anti-perfectionist element to what I'm doing for sure.
Okay, thank you. We've got two questions on cancel culture. I'm going to read them both and let you take them. The first is from Ken Masugi, with whom you have interacted in the past, and he says all sorts of nice things about you, but I'm not going to read it in public. But he says, have your students ever mounted a serious effort to have you canceled? Are you disappointed? Which piece of scholarship of yours might most readily meet that fate in these preposterous times? So let's take that one, and then we'll go to the next one.
Oh, what a funny question. No, they haven't launched such a campaign. But certainly Oxford has been, in Oxford political theory, has experienced many of the kinds of controversies that other universities have experienced in recent years, and concerns about the curriculum and diversifying the curriculum. And we've had lots of really productive discussions of that, I think, and we've done a good job of responding to student concerns while also maintaining a sense of the need for a curriculum and the role that a canon plays in our discipline. No, I mean, I find with the debate about cancel culture, I mean, part of what makes me sad very often is that, I mean, students are students, right? They're learning. They're learning how to respond to disagreement. They're learning how to express themselves. They're learning how to try to make the world better than they found it. And I don't think that we ought to be too hard on them if sometimes the strategies they adopt are counterproductive. I mean, going back to Borden's question, I guess, well, very often, sometimes these campaigns lead to profound harms. And so when I teach Mill, for instance, to my first year students, I always really want them to sit with his arguments about social tyranny as being worse and more harmful, in fact, than political tyranny in some ways. It's a good Tocquevillian argument as well. 10. And I find that they are actually really receptive to that argument. They get that. But yeah, if there's anything, I mean, what is the most controversial? I mean, I think frankly, there are quite a lot of controversial statements in Mere Civility that I was sure someone would call me out on, but no one ever did. So maybe that's just, I'm just waiting for that to happen. But my new book is
should I read them out right now?
I think my defense of civilizing discourses, for instance, probably was intended to be provocative. But my equality book is, I think, touching on some controversial topics, for instance, about the difference between equality and equity. But I do it as a political theorist and a historian of political thought. So I'm not interested in simply, offering a hot take on a controversial question. I mean, I think that, on Twitter, there's plenty of people participating and contributing to the take factory. That's not my role. My role is that of a scholar.
So the other question on cancel culture comes from Tyler Jacobs, who just asked for your general thoughts on it. And would this be a modern day example of the Lockean elitist society you mentioned? If so, what implications do you think this would have for a civil democratic society? What other ways would you suggest for approach such extreme differences of opinion?
So I have a lot of thoughts on cancel culture, but I'll keep it brief. So one thought is the one I alluded to before, which is the sense that often cancel culture is young people working out how to advocate for the causes they care about. But on the other hand, I'm very concerned, or maybe bemused, by commentators or colleagues who deny that cancel culture exists. I think that clearly there is a cultural shift afoot, and the cancel culture label, is imperfect, but it certainly describes something about a kind of growing social intolerance of disagreement that I think liberals ought to be worried about. But on the elitism point, so I said, it's young people kind of working out how to pursue justice or progressive ends and kind of learning about how to do that. I do think there's an elitist element that is in line with what I diagnose in Locke, which is basically, there's this tendency in the history of political thought for theorists of civility to hold themselves up as exemplars and then point to their opponents as exemplars of incivility, right? So they're exemplars of civility, and the people they disagree with are exemplars of incivility. And I think you just see the same tendency today, and a lot of progressives, and I don't think it's unique to progressives, actually. I mean, conservative cancel culture is also really noxious and something we need to talk about. But the idea that, what justice demands is that people learn to speak properly, I think that is an instinct that appeals to highly educated elites. So the obsession with policing speech, I do think, is a product of elitism. And it ought to be resisted.
Okay, thank you. We've got a question about Roger Williams, but first, Borden wants it known that he's a descendant of Roger Williams. I guess, Borden, that explains your hot tongue. But the question that we have comes from David Fott, our colleague and friend at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And he asked, does Williams' view of civil disagreement rely on a separation of the physical from the mental, in which physical attack is worse than mental attack because physical attack prevents evangelism? But if so, isn't that claim that physical attack is worse than mental attack exactly what his Christianity denies?
So the physical mental wouldn't be his distinction. I think it would be the civil body and goods versus spiritual. body and goods, and spiritual body just means the soul. So no, I mean, but for Williams, there's a kind of hierarchy of ends that's relevant here. So the idea is that you can't convert a person if you kill them. But ultimately not killing them is in pursuit of a spiritual good, which is their conversion and salvation. So again, I think it sort of sounds not appealing, or certainly, or at least not intuitive to a kind of modern secular liberal, but I think that it's worth considering. Look, I think the ends that we pursue, in line with a question Borden asked earlier, are by and large not spiritual ends. They're not salvation in the way that Williams cared about, by and large. You know, although there are plenty of evangelical Christians in the United States, there, you know, few of them are kind of Roger Williams style evangelicals. But the idea that I try to make the argument that if you care about social justice and you are a citizen of a tolerant liberal democracy, then it is incumbent upon you to engage in disagreement with your co-citizens, no matter how deplorable they are or deplorable their views, because that's the only way you are going to make your society more just while preserving its tolerant and liberal character. So that is the key point for me. I mean, that raises lots of questions, but I'll end.
Okay, we'll take two last questions. And this one comes from Ken Masugi again. And he asks what this emphasis on civility means for Socratic political philosophy, if it's impossible today. That is one more obliged than ever before to be civil towards one's opponents? And is this will to civility actually damaging for philosophic scrutiny? So, I mean, I might just ask first, do you take Socrates in the various dialogues in which we see him? Is he civil? And what does the emphasis on civility mean for philosophy? Philosophical.
So my immediate instinct is to say, well, Socrates is absolutely a practitioner of mere civility on Williams's model. I mean, it's precisely the virtue of the free speaker who does not hesitate to say that which he knows his audience will find offensive. So yeah, so I mean, the only addendum I would put to that is I think that Socrates, as written by Plato, is a much more ironic conversationalist than Roger Williams ever was. I don't think anyone could accuse Williams of being particularly ironical.
Yeah.
But certainly I think mere civility is actually a precondition of Socratic political philosophy.
Yeah.
And indeed, going back to sort of my students at Oxford, I mean, one of my favorite things to do is I run a Plato reading group where we read Socratic dialogues aloud and precisely talk about all of the ways in which Socrates is a right son of a gun when it comes to the way he approaches disagreement. So, and I found that in doing that, just as Socrates himself did, or maybe that's too proud, but the idea is that in talking about disagreement, you end up building the kind of conversational context that allows students to trust each other and to really, get more comfortable with saying what they actually think.
Okay, thank you. Our last question comes from my colleague, Sarah Hauser, and she wants to ask a question about mere incivility. Mere civility is a pretty low bar, but there's behavior that falls below it. In the book, you talk about William's views of the Quakers as falling below even the level of mere civility. You also talk about bestiality. But can you talk about why this is and what kind of behavior today would not meet the bar of mere civility?
So Alan, I know that because you saw the bestiality stuff, you read the footnotes. So you read the endnotes. That's really good. All the good jokes are in the endnotes. It's like Rousseau. Yeah, so even mere civility holds certain forms of incivility to be intolerable. And of course, the key example is violence. So physical violence, so violent attack. I gave a talk in California a few weeks ago, and someone in the audience asked me, well, you know, what do you do when you make a civil argument and someone punches you in the face? I say, well, you call the cops and press charges. I mean, I don't think that's a difficult one. Indeed, that's the clear case. So physical violence. But I am interested in William's concerns about the Quakers because it was precisely Quaker silence that he found so threatening. He thought that the Quaker habit of falling into silent prayer while they were in the midst of a disagreement about religious doctrine was profoundly uncivil, because precisely it was a kind of disengagement in a way that Williams found really worrying. But ultimately, Williams flirts with the idea that Quaker incivility or Quaker silence is intolerable, but ultimately he rejects that, and Rhode Island tolerates Quakers even as Massachusetts is hanging them. So there, I think it's a good example of Williams encountering a form of incivility that he thinks is potentially intolerable, but erring on the side of inclusion.
So what would be some incivility today? I mean, I guess you mentioned being punched in the face, but is there more controversial kinds of incivility that would fall below the bar?
Well, not below the bar, because again, like Williams, I err on the side of inclusion, but I am interested in the dynamics of labeling as a form of incivility. So I mean, to take a really controversial example, so Ken will be happy, I'll get myself canceled, but if you think about the label TERF, which is an acronym for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist, so in debates about gender today, the label TERF gets thrown around, and on the one hand, I think the TERF label can be really helpful because it's a label that's explanatory. It says that this is a kind of radical feminism that is predicated on the exclusion of trans people. But you can also see the way in which the TERF label is used to stigmatize certain people or certain views in an effort to kind of place them beyond the pale of respectable or reasonable debate. And so the latter case for me is a clear example of incivility, because it's a way of disengaging, of closing down, of suppressing and excluding. But my own instincts I take to be Williams' instincts, which are nevertheless, this is a tolerable form of incivility. And the way that you respond to it is by recognizing it and indeed calling it out. So again, I don't think that if you care about civil disagreement, I don't think policing speech is a way to achieve it.
Yeah, it's an interesting and sad place to end with this point about labeling. Because just today, I had a student from a foreign country stay after class to ask me what's up with labeling and identity, and that he's finding people trying to label him, and he doesn't understand like what's going on and why they're doing it. And so to maybe conclude near where we ended or where we began, it is something that requires vigilance, and it's not a problem. The question of civility is not a problem to be solved, but to be managed and to, I don't know, muddle through.
And maybe that brings us back, to starting about being aware of discursive politics and power, and the way that people make these rhetorical moves as a way of trying to delimit what's acceptable. But I think knowledge is power. So recognizing that that's what's happening, I think, can help us respond to it in more productive ways.
Well, thank you. Teresa Bejan, thank you very much for joining us today. It was very interesting. And everyone out there in Zoom land, thank you for watching too. Bye all.
Thank you for having me.